afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Ministry of Science and Innovation. Unfortunately, this is the last opportunity for me to say that. From next week, we'll be part of the Ministry for Business, Innovation and Employment. It's my pleasure today to welcome Dr. Brian Bell. Brian's a founding partner of Bell, and in that capacity, he has a vast wealth of experience in providing advice on agriculture, agribusiness, and environmental policy and management of the environment. So he's well placed to talk about his topic today, agricultural productivity and environmental sustainability. So I'd like you to join me in welcoming him.
Thank you, Veronica. Good afternoon everyone, and thank you for coming. This presentation this afternoon is about a classic wicked problem, and that is the dynamically complex and ill-structured public problem of how to ensure that we have an agriculture that continues to grow while meeting public expectations of environmental sustainability and environmental performance. There is a danger that we will throw the baby out with the bathwater. And by this I mean that the baby is our internationally competitive agricultural industry, and the bathwater is that label of dirty dairying. We all want to get rid of that dirty dairying label, but in achieving that, will we sacrifice our agricultural sector? So that's what I want to talk about this afternoon. I have a positive view of the future. I see great opportunities for New Zealand if we can see our way through this wicked problem. Now, Bell contributes to teams providing policy advice to government, industry and to corporates and communities on natural resource management issues. And I'd like to acknowledge the contributions of my colleagues in a number of companies that we work with, specifically NIWA, Becker, Ag Research, GNS Research, GNS Science, Diffuse Sources, Tipper and Associates, Envico and Market Economics, for their role in the case studies that I'm going to be referring to this afternoon. Bell's role in these studies is really to help quantify the market and non-market costs and benefits of different policy options. So just to outline where I'm going to go this afternoon, policy challenge, how to ensure that policy framework is conducive to a flourishing agriculture, and while assuring that public perceptions on the sector's environmental performance are met. I'll then touch on two case studies in the Waikato River and the Rotorua Lakes catchments, which are both sensitive waterways, both in advance of the rest of New Zealand in terms of the policy for managing environmental issues, particularly to do with agriculture, and ones that give some insights about at least where the regional councils wanted to go. I'll then build on all of this to highlight some of the principles that will give us a better chance of achieving our goals for societies. And by that I mean the four well-beings of natural, economic, environment and social. So the policy challenge, as I see it, it's over unachievable timeframes. We will lose not only our international comparative advantage in food production, but reduce our ability to fund education, health and welfare services that we all expect and demand of our government. So the policy challenge, well, agriculture is in danger of losing its public licence to operate. And this is a function of the public's perception of how well agriculture is doing in meeting the environmental bottom line that society desires. And this public perception is largely set by a media that is characterised by headlines that are really quite inflammatory and don't help to really inform the public about what is really happening out there in agriculture land. Just as an example, on TV recently I saw a program that was talking about basically about agriculture's performance on the environment. The journalist there was referring to showing pictures of beef cows and talking about dairy cows, showing pictures of cows with docked tails that were obviously taken about 10 years ago. Now, to me, that is sloppy journalism at the very best, and at the worst, it's disingenuous. So we have this problem with a media that's going for headlines all the time, and the real information about what's going on out there is not available to most people. So we have the headline dirty dairying, and everyone knows about that, but there's a lot going on behind that, a lot of good stuff going on behind that. And we really can't afford as a nation to be driven by a public perception that's informed by a media that's basically trying to sell their product. So what are the good things? Some of the good things. Pure Advantage has just put out a new report which highlights some of the good things that are going on in agriculture that will lead to increased competitiveness, higher incomes, higher earning jobs in New Zealand. The first thing is the sort of things that Fonterra is doing in terms of its investment in innovation, not only in New Zealand, but in Singapore, Australia and China. And it's research not only in the farming aspects around forage and bovine genetics and nutrition, but also in flavours and texturants and in packaging. The second thing is New Zealand's leadership in the research going into greenhouse gas emissions, particularly around methane and ruminant methane emissions. There's a huge amount of work through the Greenhouse Gas Consortium and also the Agricultural Research Greenhouse Gas Centre that working in an area that is extremely difficult to see progress being made in the sort of things like finding a drench or a vaccine or something like that that's actually going to change the methane emissions from ruminants, but that research is going on. There's also growth in bioactives that's really groundbreaking work, particularly in things like colostrum, manuka honey, antioxidants for black currants, the supercritical extracts that produce anti-inflammatory, antifungal and antimicrobiological properties. The last area I think is in high-tech advances in water and soil management, particularly around automated smart irrigation systems that can deliver water depending on soil type, depending on where the irrigator is travelling over. Systems are hugely more efficient than what they were even a decade ago, and compared to the old water dike system when I first started in agriculture, quantum times more efficient. But that's just an example. Minimum tillage, smart placement of fertiliser and so on, the very big increases in software that is becoming prevalent in the agricultural sector. All these things are helping to improve efficiency and to keep the industry competitive. Pure Advantage acknowledges that progress on targets, acknowledge that a lack of targets on nutrient flows is holding back solutions on nutrient discharges. And it's this area of nutrient discharges that is the big issue facing agriculture. The point source discharges that we see in the paper just this morning, those things are not the big issue. The big issue is the nutrients from like nitrogen and phosphate that either travel over the ground in terms of phosphate as runoff, or for nitrogen going into the groundwater and getting into aquifers and ending up in sensitive waterways. Those are the really big issues that we really haven't started to tackle yet, but are starting to be addressed, and that's what I want to move on to when I talk about the case studies. So, we don't hear enough about the good things that are happening, and I hope that those few examples I've given give you some confidence that that good things are happening. And I also need to say that the changes that are required on farms fall into the category of being requiring whole farm system changes. So it's not just a matter of changing your fertiliser regime. Whole systems have to be changed. And if we look at the history of whole farm system changes, this is not something that will occur over a short period. To make whole farm system changes, we're talking about a 30-year time frame, if it's business as usual. So if we have a look at the sort of adoption curve that is implied by whole system change, we see that it breaks down into 4 or 5 categories. There's those innovators right at the beginning who are ahead of research, who actually drive the research agenda in a lot of ways. Then behind those are about at that point. Less than 16% of farmers are really at the point of managing their diffuse discharges. So we've got a huge body of the early majority and then the late majority who adopt that we have to bring along with those early adopters and innovators. The laggards, the ones on the right-hand side of this curve, we're never going to change those people for one reason or another. They're at the end of their careers or they're so seated in their ways, we won't change them. The way to make change there is to change ownership or change the management of the assets. So if we have a look at the curve on the bottom, which is basically a cumulative adoption curve, this shows that we can reduce the time frame typical adoption of a period of 30 years down to 20, but and we might achieve half of that adoption rate over the first 5 years, but that will take considerable resources to shift farmers into new systems. It's not something that can be done by exhorting farmers to change. It's not something that can be done by fining them and penalising them. It has to be done through incentives that, and through education to show farmers that it can be done and it will be to their benefit, both to their bottom line in terms of their economics and also to the environment. So I'd now like to turn to the Waikato River. I was involved in the Waikato River independent scoping study as the economist and worked with a group led by NIWA. This is the first of what I expect to see more in management between the Crown and the River Iwi to restore the health and well-being of the river so that it is swimmable and able to collect food from over its entire length. A very ambitious aspiration. And the way Maori see it is that it is the river of life, and each curve is more beautiful than the last. And there are many dimensions of a river that we perhaps, unless we're living close to it, do not regard as being of real importance, but Maori do. So, just briefly, the independent scoping study looked at 3 scenarios to improve the river. Scenario 1 was expenditure. Scenario 2 was an optimised package of a restoration with low risk and high cost benefit cost ratios. And scenario 3 was all those actions plus some additional ones that were either not well proven or had low benefit cost ratios. And the priority actions that resulted from progress on these aspirations for the river, which were taken from the NEMA report, are shown here. Now you see that there's 13 of them, 13 aspirations for the river. And basically the red bars are where we are right now with the river, and green are the aspirations that will be achieved if the priority actions set up by the scoping study were achieved. So we basically go from a D- to a B+ or an A over the 30 years of the program, if those priorities are put in place. So if we have a look at the cost of doing that, well, it's about $1.9 billion in present value terms, 30 years at 8% discount rate. There are some benefits, 570 million with a net cost of about 1.4 billion, 1,400 million. There are some community or regional-wide and national-wide implications of this program that are positive for the region, but because the rest of the nation ends up paying for a lot of this, under the assumptions that are used, this actually means a negative impact in terms of jobs throughout the rest of the economy. So there are costs that are very real. The benefits are more in the area of non-market benefits that they quantify, but nevertheless we do try and quantify them. They can be categorised as active non-market benefits, such as the ecosystem services that are provided by the river in terms of kaimoana and access and other such things like that. But then there are the passive non-market benefits in terms of the aesthetics of the river and the biodiversity, the increase in biodiversity. Those are really important as well. And if we distill everything down to a bottom line, the study showed that these non-market benefits, as shown by all those aspirations that I showed on the previous slide, that they are likely to be of a similar order to the real market costs. So, and that will take us up to a river in 30 years' time that looks somewhat different to what we have now. So what is agriculture's contribution to this? Well, about half the cost, a net cost of 700 million, borne by dairy farmers and by dry stock farmers, because they will have to reduce their environmental footprint. To do that, they need to undertake quite major nutrient and effluent management changes to the way they operate, divert runoffs, bring in wetlands as part of the farm, plant riparian buffers along rivers and streams, and to use technologies like nitrate inhibitors. In dry stock farms, the big cost is fencing off streams. The big issue on dry stock farms is really around erosion and sediments that get into rivers, and also the runoff of phosphate. So fencing streams is a huge cost because of the in terms of cost effectiveness, because the less intensive nature of farming on dry stock farms. So there is both a productivity loss and a cost increase that agriculture will bear. So we see that As a result of this, the scoping study projections, agricultural productivity will be challenged with less income in the region. Cost structures will increase, which means there will be other places that are more profitable for people to operate in dairying. We'll see cost increases on dry stock farms and land use change to forestry. Now, farmers will need professional advice to make the whole system changes that are implied by the scenarios. And this will take time, not only time to implement, but even more time to see the benefits because of the lags in the system, particularly for nitrogen. So I think my major plea for people to understand is that while we all want to see instantaneous change to the environment for the better, the reality is it will take decades before a lot of these benefits become obvious. Now shifting to the Rotorua Lakes, there's a problem of around agriculture as well. It's a major source of issues with the Rotorua Lakes. The sustainable load of nitrogen going into the lakes is about 435 tonnes of nitrogen per year. Currently, there's 725 tonnes ending up in the lakes, which means there needs to be a saving of about 300 tonnes per annum reduction in nitrogen to get the lakes to the point where the goal of water quality that's set for Rotorua Lakes. Now, pastoral agriculture contributes about 72% of the nitrogen and 43% of the phosphate, so it's pretty much an agricultural problem. Now that some of the major point source issues have been dealt with, particularly the city sewage issues and also the ability to divert a lot of the problem in Lake Rotorua down the Waikato River as opposed to going into Lake Rotorua and ending up with algal blooms in that lake. So reducing again will take decades to occur. Now this is largely because where dairying is in the catchment, less than 10% of it lies within a 10-year continent. By that I mean within the area where it's less than 10 years for nitrogen to reach the lake from the time that it is deposited by a cow in terms of in form of urine in the paddock. And 68% of dairy land is beyond the 50-year contour. So it's going to take, even if action is taken today, it's going to be another 50 years before about 68% of that nitrogen will arrive at the lake. And for dry stock, it's even more so, 75% beyond the 50-year contour. And so there is a time lag between implementation and measurable results, which creates an economic drag. And the top one is from 0 to 300 years, and the bottom one is from 0 to 900 years, but they match up across those first 300 years. So we can see there around, for nitrogen, about half of all the nitrogen will reach the lake within 1 year. The other 50%, we can say, which arrives via the deep aquifers, it will take 100 years before 60% of that nitrogen has reached the lake. So there's, and for sheep and beef, it will be 100 years before only 40% of the nitrogen will reach the lake. So we've got some big time lags ahead of us. Just having a look at the scenarios that we looked at for this case study. we had on the left-hand column the base land use, 5,000 hectares of dairy, 54,000. 1, 2 and 3 we look at different ways of achieving the objective of removing 300 tonnes of nitrogen per annum out of the system. Scenario 2 is halving the dairy area. Sorry, scenario 1, halving the dairy area. Scenario 2, going to 0, no dairying in the Rotorua catchment. And then scenario 3 is a midpoint. Scenario 2 doesn't deliver the full 300 tonnes, as we'll see in a minute, but the other two do. The other key thing is that around 30 to 40% increase in forestry due to changes in land use out of dairying and out of dry stock to achieve the goals set by the council. Now, that's important because forestry at this stage is not competitive with dry stock farming. So there is a cost associated with shifting from dry stock farming to forestry without the carbon, the emissions trading scheme. If the emissions trading scheme does take hold and is fully operational, that reverses the economics considerably, with about a 40% better annual return to forestry compared to dry stock farming. So the issue is with forestry and the emissions trading scheme is that if it's fully utilised, it's a very risky scheme from a farmer's point of view. Over the last year, we've seen the price of carbon dioxide in the market go from $20 down to $6. It's a huge change, largely because there's too many of these units floating around of low quality, and while the market's oversupplied, market forces work and the price is driven down. So if you sell every unit of carbon that's accumulated in the forest, there is a obligation to pay back about 2/3 of that when the forest is harvested. It's not a free ride for the total amount that's sequestered. So you're accumulating carbon at the rate of about 30 tonnes a year during the rotation. The trees are harvested, 2/3 of that's got to be paid back. So if the price is higher when you go to harvest than what you sold it for, you have exposed to a very high financial risk. And from the calculations I've done, if $20 per tonne of carbon dioxide was achieved during the whole rotation, the forest is cut down. Any price $50 and above, if you have to buy back carbon at more than $50, you would break even. So what seems like to be a good deal, and the reason why that is because of the time value of money. You've had the use of that money during the rotation. And so the break-even point is about $50. So, but who knows where it's going to be? It could continue to be $6. It could go back. It could be hundreds of dollars, depending on supply and demand. But there is a risk-free component, and that is the component that's left in roots and slash and in the forest. Is about 1/3 of it, and that is a one-off gain. That is risk-free. So in shifting to forestry, you get that one-off gain. But it's not there the next rotation because you've already claimed it. You can play the market over the next rotations by taking a gamble that you can sell carbon at a high price and buy them back at a low price when you're going to harvest again, but that's a pretty high risk situation. So those forestry economics are really important in terms of how farming, the cost to landowners in switching land use. I just want to just show here that the under the program, most of the reduction in nitrogen is going to come from land use change. So that's shifting from dairy and shifting from dry stock to lower emitting leaching components, particularly for nitrogen. And there's very little that can come from land management change by moving to lower leaching type activities. And the costs range from, we looked at over 3 time frames. Because of these lags in the system, we wanted to have a look to see if it made any difference to whether you implemented the program over a short time frame or a long time frame. Obviously, because of the stretching things out and using discounting, the longer the period that you take to make the change, the lower the cost. By the time you bring it back to the present value. With carbon credits available, it makes a significant difference to the economics, a lot less costly than without carbon credits. Cost effectiveness. We look at where we're going to get the biggest bang for our buck by changing management and so on. And we see here that shift from dry stock farming to forestry with carbon credits is actually cost effective, so it's a negative cost, in other words a benefit by doing that. The problem with it is that you deny yourself cash flow for 25, 26, 28 years, so you have to fund that in some way. Next best option is to go from dairy to lifestyle blocks, and so on, right down to going from dairy to low nitrogen dry stock, $41 per kilogram of nitrogen leached. So there's quite a range of things you can do, and you want to do the most cost-effective things first. If we have a look at the present worth of nitrogen, if we're going to discount dollars, why shouldn't we discount nitrogen as well? Because one would suppose a kilogram of nitrogen leached this year is worth more to people than a kilogram of nitrogen leached in 20 years' time. So if we use the same discount rate, what we do is divide the present value of the cost by the present value of the nitrogen. Then we can make comparisons taking into account society's time preference for whether we want early nitrogen removed or we're prepared to wait a bit. And of course, what it shows you is that if the discount rate is the same for both dollars and nitrogen, then time frames don't make much difference to the economics. So we can achieve the overall benefit at a similar cost whether you implement over 10 years, 25 or 50 years. But it does make a difference over which scenario you adopt. The net present value of benefits. Again, non-market values. We did some survey work in 2004 in Rotorua willingness to pay for improved water quality using a contingent valuation survey. And we found, when we updated that to today's money values, that residents were prepared to pay about 47 million in present value terms. And anglers that came from outside the region were prepared to pay quite a bit more per person, but that ended up being at about 12 million. In total, about 60 million, which equates or is better than the direct market costs of the program. So the economics of it do actually stack up. Right, some things we need to be aware of and drawing some conclusions from this. Firstly, these cost-benefit analysis results assume current technology. But if we get the policy framework right, we should be able to do much better than that. Particularly if we create an environment that encourages farmers to innovate and to improve rather than just hitting them over the head with a big stick and fining them. Having a lack of actual targets for farmers to aim at is a big impediment to making progress and demotivates farmers from doing everything. They're basically in a holding pattern, waiting for the scientists and the policymakers to come up with firm limits that they can then target and get to grips with. If we make significant progress, I believe the first thing that needs to happen is to try and get rid of that tail and that distribution that I showed you before of adoption. So those people who are not going to change for one reason or another, if we can take them out of the system and bring in people in a new headspace, that's where we'll make significant gains. The other area is that in this area of innovation, which I've talked about. So what are the conclusions that come out of the Rotorua study? Firstly, this point that farmers are not going to do anything. They're waiting and seeing what the policy is. So we can't expect major change until we have good policy in place. And we haven't got it. Depending on circumstances on individual properties, with new policy in place, there could be a range of actual benefit from making these whole system changes to the other polar position where the actual viability of the operation is put in jeopardy. And there's a whole range of situations between that. The research has shown that there's no prescription to making changes on individual farms because of the basic resource that farmers to deal with, the management of the properties and so on. So any change has to be, farmers have to be approached on a one-on-one basis. It can't be done through a broad-based prescriptive approach. And to achieve the sort of things that we want to see will require professional help to farmers to achieve the targets efficiently. So in the policy environment right now, I see a vacuum, one that's being filled by ad hoc regulation by individual councils. The two that I briefly introduced this afternoon are in those lead areas. The Waikato River, Lake Taupo came before that, and they are really just trying to find their way without any, at this stage, major national targets being set. There is a common interest from all the stakeholders to achieve good outcomes, both on productivity and on environmental sustainability. And from, I think that the huge thing that is positive is what has been going on in the Land and Water Forum. The work they have done has created a platform for positive change by getting people around the table and talking to each other rather than taking pot shots from the trenches. As we saw in the 60s, when agriculture had to go through a major change and wean itself pretty abruptly off subsidies, that change was facilitated by strong rural leadership. And that's something that we desperately need in agriculture today. There's a leader of the stature of Sir Peter Elworthy who can take the industry through to this new environment. Progress is being made. For example, we've seen in the paper every week the Dominion Post comes out with some banner headline about dirty dairying, and talking about, particularly about effluent discharges. The reality is there will always be mistakes made. It's not a perfect system. It's like saying that because we've got a fire brigade sitting at the corner, we're never going to have fires anymore. There will be mistakes. It's part of the nature of the game. But we can still make considerable progress, particularly on that effluent side of things. And the statistic you don't hear is that actual serious breaches of effluent discharges are down by 65% over 3 years. but they're still too high. There's significant progress being made. So what are the initiatives that need to be done for agriculture? Well, the first one is we need to have targets for farmers. Targets that, if achieved, will fix the problem. And that is one of the issues that's really a problem for policymakers and scientists in this area. There's a desperate haste to find a target, and the one that's really been caught hold of is nitrogen. But it might not be the right target, it might be phosphorus. And so we need to be very careful about establishing targets. It needs to be a holistic approach, not just to grab something because it might help. So that's really important. And we must get away from the prescriptive input-based restrictions, because that will stifle initiative. And that's what we desperately need to move to a new era. Farmers need outcome-based targets that will encourage innovative solutions. And my experience is that when those sort of targets are set for farmers, they will achieve them. They will find ways to achieve them. So the framework for a whole system is a collaborative process. And if we just move through what I see as being the key steps in this, first we've got to set the objectives, then define the limits that farmers need to target. We need to see who contributes to the problem, and it's not only farmers. And that's a point that's really missed by the media. Dairying is a pretty easy target. There's 11,000 dairy farmers out there. It's pretty easy to have a go at them. What about the rest of us, the 4.5 million or 5 million of the rest of us who should be making changes as well, particularly in the areas of sewage discharges from towns and cities. Again, they're usually mistakes and errors, but they should be hammered just as hard as the dairy farmers. So we need to make sure that everyone who is a contributor to this problem is handled in an even-handed way. So we've got to divide up the actions, and that means all of us taking a part to play. And then we've got to be able to monitor and evaluate to show that we're making progress in the right direction. So we need to roll out a program of good management practice. And we need to have an industry that accepts that environmental sustainability is a given. We've had very defensive agricultural leadership up until quite recently. And it's time for agriculture, I think, to really embrace the environmental goals that go along with the economic goals. And if we're not to throw the baby out in the bathwater, it will take leadership. It will take management, and it will take innovation. And it will take a whole farm system approach, and it will take time. And we must be aware of the time that it will take to implement these things. If we look, referring back to the adoption curve, it will take 20 years to achieve a whole system change for agriculture. Not 5 years, we might shift half the farmers by then, but it will take time. So if I go back to my agriculture is what we do best as a nation. We can't afford to see that it is hobbled bad policy. Okay, so if I go back to that original challenge, that the risk is that in trying to achieve public perceptions of acceptable environmental standards over unachievable timeframes, we will lose the advantage in food production, but reduce our ability to fund education, healthcare and welfare services that we all expect and demand. Thank you very much. Happy to take questions if we've got time.
Could you just state your name and affiliation, Brian?
Sally White from Scipio Research Group. Targets are all very well, but they're sort of toothless if they're not accompanied by incentives. And I just wondered what role you saw for markets in nitrogen and phosphorus. We have carbon markets with the potential to create nitrogen and phosphorus discharge caps and trades.
Well, I think markets for nutrients do have a role. There are big problems with markets for nutrients because generally the number of players, the markets are too thin to establish good markets. But we're talking about individual catchments, so we're not talking about a group, a national group. So there are, yes, there is a potential, but I see there are problems with it. I think the incentives are more around setting good targets that are realistic and having leadership buy into that, and then farmers will make the change.
In the spirit of even-handedness and treating different industries and groups, it does strike me that the fishing industry in New Zealand has for many years been subject to just the same kind of somewhat frothy-mouthed public pressure, often whipped up by the media and by green groups, often quite effectively for seals or birds or whatever. And yeah, to a large degree, nobody said, "Oh, look, just give them time. It'll take a while." They've been hit quite hard in many cases by things like the Best Fish Guide and so on. And you could probably say that it's really stimulated a culture of innovation. I mean, there are a lot of really good voluntary initiatives that bits of the fishing industry have done. Some of them quite old school, like area closures, but others quite innovative, like technology to reduce bycatch and so on. And I'm wondering if it might not be too bad a thing that the agricultural industry is being expected to just sharpen up, and it might be something there. I'm not excusing bad journalism, that's just, it's beyond the pale, but I'm wondering if it might be part of instilling an innovation culture in our agricultural industry to say to them, look, the public wants this, we can't control the public or media, how about we help you guys innovate? Do we need to protect them from the public?
I don't think we need to protect farmers from the public. They're a pretty robust sort of group. I think the thing that really does irk farmers is if somebody who accidentally pipe splits and discharges dairy effluent into a waterway gets heavily fined while the little town down the road does the same thing and it's just brushed under the carpet. I mean, that really annoys farmers. And that's why I'm talking about even-handedness. But in terms of incentives, farmers as a group regard themselves as stewards of the land. I mean, everybody hears this and talk about it, but it's very real. And but there's always that group at the bottom who you're never going to change. So really, you have to find ways of getting rid of that group and then work on the big majority who want to make change, but really don't know how to go about it. And it requires one-on-one individual advice to actually make those people change.
University. Just brief comment, I'd back farmers and the research industry come up with plenty of innovation. Not that it's an easy problem to solve, of course, but one of the things that strikes me, because in my work I deal with agricultural people and ecologists, is selling a story, if you like, to both sides. Which is a classic policy problem. There's a need to clean up, obviously, and there's a need to continue to produce. How easy do you think it really is to convince the stronger end of the green side of things, I guess, that it will take 50 years or 40 years or whatever? I mean, the reality is, on one hand, that's reality. On the other hand, it does sound bad if your main focus in life is protecting riverways, I guess. If you're a farmer, of course, you see it quite differently. You go out of business if you have to operate any fast. So, I mean, you've sort of mentioned that. I'm just interested to hear you expand on that. This difficulty of, I guess, getting the realistic story out there in the sort of public mind.
Well, it seems that if we rely on the media to do that, it's not going to happen, because media have good news stories, they don't sell, and whereas bad news stories do. So I think we need, it's the onus on the profession to educate the media and educate the green lobby as to what are the realities of making real whole system change. We tend as human beings to have a very short time frame on the way we look at things. We don't step back and say, well, it's taken us 150 years to get to this point. Do we expect that, flip that round in 5 years or 1 year? I mean, it's totally unrealistic. And it's a intergenerational issue that we've got to look at here. Is what is it going to be like for our grandchildren and their grandchildren? And the key thing is to be able to demonstrate that however slow, we are actually making progress towards it. So I think it's a matter of education.
Griff Jones, MSI Strategy Team. I just want to ask, you showed some interesting charts about fluctuating pricing and carbon credits. Would you say then that a tax, either on nitrogen use, would be kind of escalating over time, or some kind of wider carbon tax is actually a better solution than the kind of trading schemes and all that to deal with this kind of problem? You know, so you had that target of kind of, it's about 735. I can't remember what unit it was per ton, so you need to get down to 430 or something. Would it kind of, yeah, would it be better to have a kind of escalating nitrogen tax, maybe hypothecated for research, or with a similar deduction in kind of corporation tax or something, just to kind of, maybe that would be a better measure, just so you've got a bit more kind of, you know what the tax is going to be for investment purposes, so you get over some of those issues you're talking about.
Well, I would need to be convinced that we need to impose a tax to achieve the sort of results.
I'm not talking about an extra tax. I'm talking about kind of replacing some of the kind of current taxes on business with a carbon and nitrogen tax. So it's revenue neutral, but incentivising the right kind of behaviour.
Well, yes, maybe you could see potential there, but we've got to think of this in a holistic way. If you tend to focus on one thing without all the other components in the equation, we're most likely to get it wrong. And so I think that just by establishing targets for agricultural leadership to come on board with this, to what the public really want, that will be enough. I go back to that example of removal of subsidies. In the 60s, the early 60s, the total net revenue from farming was subsidy, was all subsidy. And it was clearly unsustainable. You can't subsidise your major export industry. I think we're in a similar sort of era, changing period. And over the next 3 or 4 years will be critical in terms of making the right decisions in terms of policy and setting the right targets. We have a time frame of 3 or 4 years where if we get that right, then I think that will help, that will make a huge impact without doing, having other policy moves of penalising or taxing or creating incentives by giving premiums or whatever. Farmers will need help over to provide, to pay for the professional advice they get. Maybe that's one area. But again, we've had 20 years of benign neglect of agriculture in terms of policy after the famous agriculture as a sunset industry comments 20 years ago. But agriculture has still shown the largest productivity gains of any sector in the economy. It's still our strength. So the resilience is there. I think it's just a matter of getting the targets right and getting leadership behind it. There's a lot of goodwill out there to do it.
I'm just going to address emissions. Sorry, Stephen Cox on the side, formerly Matt. I'm just going to address a point for Griff, which leads into the question for that Rotorua case study. The way the ETS is currently legislated is from 2015 there will be a charge on nitrogen applied. It works out at $20 a tonne at about $90,000 per tonne of nitrogen applied, which on the 300 tonnes we're saving about 270 million per year going into the lake. In your Rotorua case study, what application of either international carbon liabilities or farmer-level ETS did you apply? I'm asking because A, that will affect the cost of land transition, but also it will affect the distributional costs of catchment versus non-catchment owners. If the state catches that $270 million, that's a rather big change to what the state should be able to support.
Yes, in terms of those sort of policies, the only one that we did look at was the application of the ETS on forestry, but we certainly didn't look at any sort of nitrate.
Well, that's in the ETS legislated from 2000.
If it is applied, if it becomes policy.
That is policy. It's law now.
Hello, Christopher Berg from Pro Wellington, R&D Investment Management. I've just got visions of lower surface area contained farming really to have controlled nutrient. Is that some of the innovations that you're talking about?
Well, I think the innovations are hard to predict.
Yeah.
It will depend on the environment that is there, but it could range all the way from very intensive high mitigation type activities where cows are off the paddock for apart from when they go out and eat grass, maybe 4 hours a day, something like that, where the effluent is contained and used as a fertiliser, will have very positive effects compared to what is happening now, right through to the other end of the scale down to organics, low input, low intensity systems, and there'll be everything in between. It will depend on the individual circumstances of the farm and the farmer.
Yeah, Murray Doak from Ministry for Primary Industries, based in Christchurch. Enjoyed your talk, Brian, because all those issues are exactly what we're grappling with. I mean, what do you see as the role of something like NPI, who's kind of in the nexus of these two? What do you see as the role for NPI that perhaps is not happening at the moment? Because we're right in the nexus there. I think the gentleman here about the timeline and selling that timeline to the wider community is quite an important part.
Well, that's a good question. I was in the Ministry of Agriculture in the 70s and first half of the 80s, and during that period we were involved in dreaming up schemes to make agriculture more competitive because of other distortions in the economy. That was all dumped in the mid-80s, and we got right away from a real hands-off approach to agriculture, and there was talk about sustainability. There's been talk about sustainability for a long time, but we haven't seen much in terms of agricultural policy. We certainly haven't seen the sort of things that were done in the 60s and 70s to encourage agricultural productivity. Things around the advisory services division was a major plank of policy. There was something like 200 farm advisors out there helping farmers to increase productivity. If you looked at the number of agricultural consultants on farms now, it would be a fraction of that, I would think. We're not producing those people through the universities now. There's a huge gap in the professional advice that's there, which goes back to this successive governments turning their back on agriculture. As to where the role of the ministry going forward, it's in my view, it's got to be about setting the policy environment and having a framework in place of the sort that I outlined, working with the other stakeholders, the Land and Water Forum particularly, to come up with targets that are scientifically based, that are holistic in nature, and don't focus on one particular output or one particular input. There's quite a big program there to work on, I think. And then it's whether it is the role of the state to assist farmers make the transition from the system they have now to the new system that's going to be environmentally sustainable and productive as well. So that's a huge question. At the moment, Dairy NZ has a number of farm consultants out there, but what I hear is that they're not really trained to provide the type of advice that farmers need. So there's a whole lot of issues that are related to getting the right advice to make the transitions that are needed. It's just not there.
I have one last question, Zach.
Oh, gee. Jeff Simmons from the Morgan Foundation. Thanks, Brian. It's really interesting. I just wondered, and forgive me if I missed this at the start, I went to the wrong place, whether I've sort of seen some evidence that perhaps because of the capital incentives around farming, that some farmers are overstocking beyond the point of actual maximising profit. And I just wondered whether, how that plays into your analysis, or whether you have any thoughts on whether there's policy levers there too, like capital gains taxes and stuff.
Well, I think that is an issue. I think that there is certainly a proportion of farmers who are overcapitalised. Farmers tend to pay more for their farms than what you could expect from a productive valuation. So they are factoring in some future growth when they go and purchase farms. That puts the pressure on to increase productivity. The way they've done that over the last 10 years is to use urea, replacing clover as the mechanism for creating nitrogen to grow grass. And we've seen a huge increase in nitrogen applied to boost grass growth, to increase productivity, to justify the price that farmers have paid for land. I think there's a proportion who have gone over the top. There's been too much emphasis on productivity and not enough profit on optimising profit. That if the real cost of the environmental damage was factored into their cost structure, they would farm in a different way that would be less intensive, because they would have to, while they're exporting their nitrogen through the groundwater and getting away with it right now, if that was internalised as a cost, that would change the whole economics of farming. But we can't just single out farmers. We have to ensure that there's even-handedness about those sorts of policies. And we should all be taking a part in this move to a more environmentally sustainable, clean and green New Zealand.